Manhattan, New York City. In February 1946, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was 40 years old, serving as the undisputed controller of Harlem's numbers racket, seated inside the VIP room of the Stork Club on East 53rd Street. The Stork Club was known for wealth and power, a place where celebrities, politicians, and crime bosses met behind closed doors. It was a setting where influence mattered more than reputation, and where business was settled in quiet conversations that shaped the streets of New York. At the time, Bumpy Johnson was one of the most powerful black figures in organized crime, and the environment rewarded control and calculation while punishing weakness and open defiance. Across the table from him sat Charles "Lucky" Luciano, the man who had unified the Italian Mafia and modernized its structure. Luciano had recently been released from prison after serving 9 years and was facing deportation to Italy within weeks. The authority in that room was not the government, though it lingered in the background through deportation orders and federal deals. The true authority was the criminal system of the 5 families. Frank Costello represented Luciano's interests in New York. Albert Anastasia controlled the docks. Maya Lansky handled the finances. Together, they formed a structure that dominated the city's underworld. Yet one territory stood outside their full control. Harlem. Harlem's numbers racket, an illegal lottery generating millions of dollars weekly, operated under Bumpy Johnson's command. It relied on community trust, local runners, and protection arrangements. Previous attempts by Italian crews to take over Harlem had failed. In 1935, Dutch Schultz had tried to force his way into the business. He was later shot to death in a New Jersey tavern. Now, 11 years later, Luciano wanted what Schultz could not take. But he did not arrive with open violence. He arrived with an offer. Inside the Stork Club that night, Luciano brought 6 men, including Costello, Anastasia, Lansky, and armed bodyguards. Bumpy Johnson arrived alone, dressed in a tailored navy 3-piece suit, carrying a leather briefcase. When he entered, every man stood except him. He remained seated, cigar lit, signaling that he would not concede position before negotiations began. This was not a social meeting. It was a test of control, leverage, and survival. Luciano stated his purpose clearly. He was leaving the country in 3 weeks. Before his deportation, he wanted stability in New York. Harlem was the final unresolved piece. He proposed a partnership. The Italians would provide protection, investment capital, and connections. In return, they would take 40% of the numbers profits. Johnson did not respond immediately. He listened. When he finally spoke, he asked one question. "What happens if I say no?" Luciano answered without raising his voice. "If you are not with us, you are against us." The meaning was understood by everyone in the room. Refusal could lead to war. But Johnson had not come unprepared. From his briefcase, he removed a photograph. It showed Albert Anastasia standing outside a warehouse in Red Hook, Brooklyn, shaking hands with a known police captain. Johnson stated he had 12 more photographs like it, documenting connections between mafia operations and corrupt officers. He made no threat. He simply explained that he could have sent them to the district attorney or the newspapers. He had not done so. The room fell silent. The authority in that moment shifted. Luciano recognized that Johnson possessed leverage. The negotiation was no longer one-sided. Johnson rejected the 40% demand. He offered 10% instead. Not as protection money, but as a service fee. The Italians would provide banking support to help manage large payouts and legal assistance for arrested runners. In return, they would receive 10% of net profits. No Italian soldiers would patrol Harlem. All payments would be delivered by courier. Harlem would remain under Johnson's control. After consideration, Luciano agreed. The deal was sealed with a handshake. 3 weeks later, Luciano departed for Italy. He never returned to the United States. The agreement remained in place for 22 years. By 1946, Bumpy Johnson had established himself as the central authority in Harlem's underworld economy. A former enforcer who had survived earlier gang conflicts and the violent power struggles of the 1930s, he carried himself with calm restraint that affected those around him. He rarely raised his voice. He rarely displayed anger. His reputation was built on measured responses and decisive action. Among Harlem's residents and operators, he represented control and protection in a system dominated by the Italian Mafia. While the five families commanded most of New York's organized crime network, Johnson maintained independent authority in a territory many believed would eventually be absorbed. He understood the numbers business in detail. It required trust from local players and consistent payouts to winners. It required discretion with police and discipline among runners. It was not sustained by force alone. His survival through the Dutch-Schultz conflict had reinforced his standing. Schultz's attempt to dominate Harlem through intimidation ended in his death. Johnson learned from that history. Direct confrontation with larger forces carried risks. Strategic positioning carried rewards. When facing Luciano in 1946, Johnson did not rely on threats or displays of power. He relied on preparation. The photographs in his briefcase were evidence of that preparation. They demonstrated access to intelligence and an understanding of political vulnerability. In a room filled with armed men, Johnson maintained composure. He negotiated from a position of equality, not submission. The agreement that followed shaped the next 2 decades. The Italians received a share without direct control. Johnson retained authority without open conflict. When he was imprisoned in 1951 and sent to Alcatraz, the arrangement continued. Frank Costello ensured financial support reached Johnson's family. When Johnson was released in 1963, the agreement remained intact. Within organized crime circles, the meeting at the Stork Club became a reference point. Not because of violence, but because violence was avoided. Johnson demonstrated that leverage could replace confrontation. That patience, when supported by preparation, could command respect. In a criminal system dominated by larger and more powerful organizations, he secured autonomy for Harlem through negotiation backed by evidence. The balance held because both sides understood the cost of breaking it. And for 22 years, that understanding was enough. But not everyone respected Bumpy Johnson. One figure in particular, Charles "Lucky" Luciano, embodied organized power on a national scale. Luciano was disciplined, strategic, and patient. He had unified the Italian Mafia under a single structure known as the Five Families. He was known for restructuring the underworld after the violent Castellammarere War and for building a commission that settled disputes without constant bloodshed. He believed crime should operate like business, with order, rules, and profit shared among those strong enough to claim it. Luciano had also learned how to survive pressure from the government. After serving 9 years in prison, he secured his release by cooperating with federal authorities during World War II. In return for helping protect the docks from sabotage, his sentence was commuted. Yet the deal came with deportation. He would be sent back to Italy. Even facing removal from the country, Luciano did not act like a defeated man. He acted like a leader securing unfinished business. He believed New York should remain under stable mafia control after his departure. Harlem, operating independently under Bumpy Johnson, represented unfinished business. Luciano did not view Harlem as a cultural community. He viewed it as revenue. The numbers racket generated millions of dollars each week. To him, that kind of income could not remain outside the larger system he had built. He had seen what happened when control was challenged by force alone. Dutch-Schultz had tried that in 1935 and died for it. Luciano learned from that failure. He understood that power did not always require gunfire. Sometimes it required patience and pressure. Still, behind the calm voice and polite language, Luciano represented a clear threat. His organization controlled the docks, the unions, gambling operations, and political protection across the city. If he chose confrontation, he had the manpower and influence to make Harlem suffer. He had men like Albert Anastasia, known for enforcement and violence. He had Frank Costello, who managed political connections. He had Meyer Lansky, who handled money with precision. Luciano himself had built a system that punished disobedience. He had learned how to operate without immediate consequence. Even prison had not ended his authority. His words still carried weight in every borough. When Luciano walked into the Stork Club that night in February 1946, he carried more than an offer. He carried the quiet power of an empire. And that empire expected compliance. Luciano continued his expansion by exploiting weaknesses inside the system. The criminal structure in New York functioned on cooperation between gangs and selective corruption within law enforcement. Police officers accepted payments. Politicians looked away. Businesses served as fronts. This network allowed operations to continue with limited interference. Luciano understood that structure better than most. He did not rely on chaos. He relied on stability supported by quiet agreements. When Dutch Schultz became reckless and attracted attention, the Mafia Commission approved his removal. The system protected itself. Authority tolerated this balance because it reduced open violence. As long as shootings did not dominate headlines and docks remained operational, certain officials preferred order over disruption. Luciano had already proven during the war that he could influence dock workers and prevent sabotage. That gave him leverage even against the federal government. This environment created a belief within the mafia leadership that expansion was inevitable. If a territory generated profit, it would eventually fall under the umbrella of the five families. Harlem, in their view, was an outlier waiting to be absorbed. Luciano's initial proposal to Bumpy Johnson reflected that belief. 40% was not presented as a request. It was presented as structure, protection, capital, and connections in exchange for a large share of profits. From Luciano's perspective, refusal would isolate Harlem. Without mafia banking support, large payouts could become unstable. Without legal protection, arrests could weaken operations. Without political cover, pressure could increase. The system favored those connected to it. Over time, Luciano came to believe that no operator in New York could survive long without mafia partnership. He had seen rivals fall. He had seen independent bosses either line or disappear. The commission system created the illusion of permanence. Even deportation did not weaken that belief. Luciano expected that after his departure, Costello and others would maintain control. Harlem, he assumed, would either join willingly or be brought into alignment through pressure. But one weakness in the system remained. It relied on information control. When Bumpy Johnson opened his briefcase and presented photographs of Albert Anastasia shaking hands with a known police captain, he exposed a vulnerability. Political protection depended on secrecy. Corruption worked only if it stayed hidden. Luciano had believed himself untouchable because he managed risk carefully. Yet those photographs showed that others could gather evidence as well. The same system that protected him could collapse under public exposure. For the first time in that meeting, the balance shifted. Luciano understood that power in New York was not only about guns and alliances. It was also about leverage. And Bumpy Johnson had demonstrated that he possessed it. The belief in untouchable control was replaced by calculation. War would damage both sides. Exposure would damage everyone. In that moment, the system revealed its limit. It could dominate through structure. It could expand through pressure. But it could not eliminate a man who prepared in silence. And Luciano, experienced enough to recognize strength when he saw it, adjusted. The first incident occurred during a routine moment inside the VIP room of the Stork Club on February 18, 1946. It was meant to be a formal meeting. Lucky Luciano had reserved the entire room. He arrived with Frank Costello, Albert Anastasia, Maya Lansky, and 3 armed bodyguards. The seating arrangement was clear. The head of the table was reserved for Luciano. When Bumpy Johnson entered, he did not wait to be directed. Without raising his voice or showing open hostility, he walked past the bodyguards and pulled out the chair at the head of the table. He sat down in the position meant for Luciano. He placed his briefcase on the table. Then he calmly lit a cigar. There was no insult spoken. No weapon drawn. No loud challenge. But the meaning was understood by every man in that room. Albert Anastasia shifted in his seat. Frank Costello's jaw tightened. The bodyguards moved their hands closer to their weapons. Luciano raised one finger and stopped them. Johnson did not apologize. He did not explain. He simply remained seated. For several seconds, no one spoke. To observers unfamiliar with Harlem's codes, Johnson's silence could have been mistaken for arrogance. But to the men in that room, it was a signal. He was not coming as a subordinate. He was coming as an equal. Luciano eventually took the seat directly across from him. The head of the table was no longer his. The conversation began. Later in the meeting, another small moment carried similar weight. When Luciano proposed taking 40% of Harlem's numbers profits, he spoke calmly and with certainty. It was presented as business. Johnson did not interrupt. He listened. After Luciano finished, Johnson asked only one question. What happens if I say no? The room went still again. Luciano answered without raising his voice. If you're not with us, you're against us. It was a controlled warning. Not shouted. Not emotional. Just stated. Johnson did not react. He did not threaten. He did not argue. Instead, he opened his briefcase and removed a photograph. He slid it across the table without speaking. The image showed Albert Anastasia shaking hands with a known police captain outside a warehouse in Red Hook. Again, there was no shouting. No immediate escalation. Johnson simply explained that he had more photographs. 12 more. He said he had not sent them to the district attorney. He had not given them to newspapers. He chose not to respond with anger. He chose to respond with information. To some in the room, his calm tone might have appeared restrained. But in that environment, restraint carried weight. Still, for a brief moment, to outside observers, his refusal to react emotionally could have appeared as weakness. He did not slam his fist. He did not threaten violence. He did not bring guards. He came alone. That image, one man facing an organized empire, could easily have been misunderstood. Those close to Bumpy Johnson had expected a different kind of reaction. In Harlem, he was known as an enforcer who had survived violent years. He had dealt with Dutch Schultz's invasion attempts. Schultz had ended up dead. Many believed Johnson would respond to pressure with force. When news spread that he was meeting Luciano alone, some assumed it would lead to conflict. Within the Italian ranks, men like Anastasia expected resistance to be loud and aggressive. They understood dominance through intimidation. They were prepared for raised voices or sudden movement. But Johnson's restraint was deliberate. He understood the structure he was facing. The 5 families controlled docks, unions, and political protection. Direct violence inside Manhattan against Luciano's circle would bring consequences beyond one meeting. Patience gave him leverage. By allowing Luciano to speak first, Johnson gathered information. By asking one controlled question, he measured the response. By presenting photographs instead of threats, he shifted the balance without triggering gunfire. Those who understood the environment recognized what was happening. Maya Lansky, who handled money and risk, saw the logic in Johnson's offer of 10% instead of 40%. He understood that stable profit was better than open war. He recognized calculation when he saw it. Luciano himself understood the signal. Johnson was not begging for protection. He was offering structured cooperation on new terms. Restraint, in that room, was not weakness. It was positioning. Johnson's refusal to react emotionally forced Luciano to reconsider the situation. A violent response would expose operations. A takeover attempt could lead to public scandal if those photographs were released. By staying calm, Johnson made the cost of escalation visible. Those who watched closely saw that he was not retreating. He was narrowing the options. The final agreement reflected that strategy. 10% of net profits. Banking support. Legal assistance. No Italian soldiers in Harlem. Payments delivered by courier. Harlem remained under Johnson's control. The meeting ended with a handshake, not gunfire. 3 weeks later, Luciano boarded a ship to Italy. He never returned to American soil. For the next 22 years, the agreement held. Some remembered the meeting as a peaceful negotiation. Others remembered it as a silent standoff. But those who understood power recognized something else. Patience, when supported by preparation, can control a room more effectively than anger. And on that night in February 1946, patience secured Harlem. The next incident occurred minutes later inside the same VIP room at the Stork Club. After Bumpy Johnson rejected the 40% demand and offered 10% instead, Albert Anastasia leaned forward in his chair. He questioned what would stop Harlem from cutting the Italians out once banking support was set up. His tone was not polite. It carried doubt and challenge. This time, the provocation was worse. It suggested that Johnson could not be trusted. Again, Johnson remained restrained. He answered calmly. He explained that the same balance protecting Harlem would also protect the Italians. If he cheated them, they would retaliate. If they cheated him, the photographs would surface. It was a stalemate. Each incident increased Luciano's confidence that pressure might still work. He believed that by allowing his men to question Johnson openly, he could test his limits. In environments like this, confidence becomes dangerous. It can push men to miscalculate silence for fear. The next incident occurred later in the meeting, when Luciano repeated his original structure. He emphasized protection, investment capital, and connections. He spoke as if Harlem required supervision to survive. The offer was framed as generosity. This time, the provocation was subtle but deliberate. It implied that Harlem's success depended on Italian backing. Again, Johnson remained restrained. He did not deny the value of banking support. Instead, he defined its price. 10%, not 40%. Service, not control. Each incident increased Luciano's confidence that negotiations still leaned in his favor. He had numbers, men, and territory across New York. Harlem was a single district. In environments like this, confidence becomes dangerous. When a powerful man assumes expansion is inevitable, he may overlook resistance that does not announce itself loudly. The next incident occurred when Luciano delivered his warning. If you're not with us, you're against us. This time, the provocation was direct. It was no longer business language. It was a reminder of consequences. The room understood what that meant. Being against the Mafia rarely ended peacefully. Again, Johnson remained restrained. He did not match the threat with one of his own. He simply opened his briefcase. He slid the photograph across the table. Each incident increased tension, but also shifted awareness. Luciano saw that Johnson had prepared carefully. The threat of violence was no longer one-sided. In environments like this, confidence becomes dangerous when it ignores evidence. The next incident occurred when Anastasia half rose from his chair after seeing the photograph. His hand moved toward his waistband. The bodyguards watched closely. For a brief second, the room stood at the edge of violence. This time, the provocation was physical. Again, Johnson remained restrained. He did not reach for a weapon. He did not stand. He continued speaking in a calm voice, explaining that he had chosen not to expose the photographs. Luciano raised his hand and stopped his men. Each incident increased awareness that the meeting could turn deadly. Yet Johnson's calm posture forced Luciano to respond with equal control. In environments like this, confidence becomes dangerous when emotion overrides calculation. Luciano avoided that mistake. The next incident occurred near the end of the negotiation. Luciano asked one final question. "Are you threatening me?" The line remained respected for 22 years. In criminal history, that boundary became the defining moment. Not because shots were fired, but because they were not. Once Harlem's control was acknowledged in that room, the future of the arrangement was sealed. The escalation had tested pride. The boundary had tested principle. The agreement preserved both. That evening, after the meeting ended and the tension left the VIP room, Bumpy Johnson spoke quietly to the men who waited for him outside. He did not celebrate. He did not boast about facing lucky Luciano and walking away with control intact. He did not threaten what he would do if the Italians broke the agreement. Instead, he stated what would happen next. He told his closest associates that the deal would be honored exactly as agreed. 10% would be delivered on time. Payments would be counted carefully. No delays. No excuses. He said that Harlem would remain disciplined. Runners would follow instructions. There would be no reckless behavior that could invite outside pressure. He explained that respect had been earned in that room, but respect could disappear if pride replaced discipline. Those who heard him understood the meaning. The agreement was not protection. It was balance. If Harlem failed to meet its obligations, the Italians would respond. If the Italians sent soldiers into Harlem, the photographs would not remain private. Johnson made clear that the strength of Harlem would not come from noise. It would come from order. He reminded them that Dutch Schultz had failed because he misunderstood the community. He tried to take without listening. He used force before building trust. He died for that mistake. Johnson's words carried no anger, only instruction. He said that from this point forward, every dollar would be documented. Every payout would be clean. The numbers business would operate more carefully than ever before. He did not threaten the mafia. He simply made it known that if boundaries were crossed, responses would not be emotional. They would be calculated. Those who stood around him understood that the meeting had not ended the danger. It had only delayed it. The agreement would hold only as long as both sides respected its limits. The photographs would remain locked away. For now. The setting of what followed was ordinary. In the weeks after the meeting, Harlem returned to routine. Writers collected bets on street corners. Runners moved envelopes quietly through familiar routes. Winners were paid in cash. Business continued as it had before, only more organized. At the docks, Italian operations continued without disruption. Warehouses opened and closed on schedule. Union workers reported for shifts. Money flowed through legitimate fronts and private accounts. 3 weeks later, Lucky Luciano boarded a ship bound for Italy. There was no dramatic farewell. No public display. Federal authorities enforced the deportation order quietly. He left American soil without incident. Routine continued as usual. Frank Costello managed affairs in New York. Maya Lansky monitored finances. Albert Anastasia returned to overseeing dock operations. The structure of the 5 families remained intact. In Harlem, Bumpy Johnson kept his office hours steady. He met with lieutenants. He reviewed collections. He ensured the 10% share was prepared and delivered monthly through agreed channels. There were no gun battles in the streets. No headlines announcing war. No public acknowledgement of the agreement. This contrast made what followed unforgettable. The absence of violence became the story. In an era when organized crime often resolved conflict through shootings and retaliation, 2 powerful figures had chosen restraint. Years later, when Johnson was arrested in 1951 and sent to Alcatraz, the routine did not collapse. The 10% continued. Costello ensured Johnson's family received support. The structure held. When Johnson walked out of prison in 1963, the agreement was still intact. The ordinary rhythm of collections, payments, and quiet cooperation lasted for 22 years. What made the story endure was not bloodshed. It was the memory of a night in February 1946 when escalation was possible at every moment, yet never realized. The VIP room at the Stork Club returned to hosting entertainers and politicians. The marble floors were cleaned. The chairs were rearranged. Guests laughed and drank as they always had. But for those who knew what happened there, the room carried a different weight. In that ordinary space, power had been tested without gunfire. Routine had survived confrontation. And Harlem had remained under its own control. In the weeks following the agreement, the arrangement held in silence. Payments moved as promised. Couriers traveled between Harlem and Italian offices without interference. The streets remained calm. But power is rarely content with limits. The final provocation came quietly at first, then publicly. It happened when word reached Harlem that one of the Italian captains had sent 2 men uptown to observe collections. They did not announce themselves as collectors. They stood on corners where numbers writers worked. They watched runners move envelopes. They asked questions that did not belong to them. This time, there was no ambiguity. The agreement had been clear. No Italian soldiers in Harlem. No patrols. No presence on the streets. When Johnson received confirmation, he did not raise his voice. He did not call for weapons. He asked for names, locations, and time. Later that afternoon, he walked onto Lenox Avenue in a tailored suit, moving without hurry. The two men were still there, leaning against a storefront, speaking low but watching everything. Witnesses later said Johnson approached them alone. He did not shout across the street. He did not signal others to surround them. He stood directly in front of them. The message was simple. Harlem was not theirs to monitor. The men attempted to explain. They claimed misunderstanding. They said they were only passing through. Johnson listened. Then he gave a single instruction. Leave Harlem. Now. It was not a request. Word traveled quickly downtown that evening. The message reached Frank Costello's office before sunset. By nightfall, Luciano's circle understood that the boundary had been tested and rejected. For Johnson, standing on that sidewalk was not an act of emotion. It was enforcement of terms. He had tolerated pressure inside a private room. He had negotiated percentages. He had offered partnership. But public presence on Harlem streets crossed the agreement. And he stood. According to witnesses, what happened next unfolded in seconds. One of the Italian men hesitated. He shifted his weight and reached inside his coat, not for a weapon, but perhaps for a cigarette or a note. The movement was small. Johnson reacted immediately. His hand rose, not wildly, but with control. He struck the man across the face with the back of his hand, sharp and direct. The sound echoed against the storefront window. The second man stepped forward, but before he could act, two of Johnson's lieutenants appeared from across the street. They had not been visible before. Their movements were precise and disciplined. No guns were drawn. No shots were fired. The first man fell back against the wall, stunned more by the message than the blow itself. Johnson stepped closer. His voice remained calm. He reminded them of the agreement made at the Stork Club. 10%. Banking support. No soldiers in Harlem. He told them to carry that message back exactly as spoken. Before intervention was possible, the outcome was decided. The two men left Harlem on foot. No ambulance arrived. No police report was filed. No retaliation followed that night. Downtown, when the story reached Costello, the response was immediate. Orders were given. No further presence would be sent into Harlem without invitation. The line would be respected. Luciano, already preparing for deportation, received word of the incident. He did not send punishment. He did not escalate. He understood the signal. The action on Lenox Avenue had been brief, controlled, and public enough to make its point. Johnson had not declared war. He had demonstrated enforcement. From that moment forward, no Italian soldiers appeared on Harlem streets to monitor collections. Couriers continued to handle payments. The 10% arrived monthly. The decisive action lasted only seconds. But its effect lasted decades. In organized crime, reputation is often built on violence. In this case, it was built on precision. Johnson had allowed escalation inside a private room without reaction. He had answered threats with information. He had accepted partnership under terms of equality. But when the boundary moved from negotiation table to public street, restraint ended. The outcome was not a gunfight. It was clarity. Harlem remained Harlem. And the agreement, once tested, held firm. The resolution did not come with gunfire. It came years later, in 1951, when federal agents moved against Bumpy Johnson on narcotics charges. The arrest did not happen in a dramatic raid. It happened through investigation, paperwork, and quiet preparation. By then, the agreement with the Italian Mafia had been operating for 5 years. Payments were steady. Harlem remained under Johnson's control. The 10% continued to move downtown without delay. When agents arrived to take him into custody, Johnson did not run. He did not barricade himself inside an office. He did not call for men to gather in the streets. He did not challenge the authority of the federal government. He stood. Witnesses later said he adjusted his jacket before placing his hands forward. His posture remained straight. His face showed no panic. He understood the difference between street authority and federal authority. The charges would send him to Alcatraz. Years would be taken from him. Control of Harlem would require delegation and discipline in his absence. But the agreement he had built was not dependent on noise or fear. It was built on structure. Johnson stopped immediately when instructed. He did not resist arrest. There was no struggle on the sidewalk. No attempt to negotiate in that moment. Before being removed, he spoke to one of his closest associates who stood nearby. His voice was calm. "Keep it running clean. Pay what's owed. Harlem stays Harlem." It was a simple line. Those who heard it understood that he was not speaking only about money. He was speaking about order. After he was taken away, the business continued. Frank Costello ensured that Johnson's family was supported. The Italians received their agreed percentage. No soldiers entered Harlem streets to patrol. The balance held. When Johnson walked out of prison in 1963, he did not return to chaos. He returned to a system that had survived his absence. The resolution of the conflict that began in 1946 was not a final battle. It was endurance. Johnson's arrest could have broken the agreement. It did not. His surrender to federal authority was controlled and deliberate. He knew when to stand firm and when to yield. In the Stork Club, he held his ground. On Lenox Avenue, he enforced a boundary. In front of federal agents, he complied. Different forces required different responses. The final image was not of violence, but of composure. A man placing his hands forward without resistance. A quiet instruction to protect structure. A reminder that power is not only measured in confrontation, but in knowing when to preserve what has already been secured. Harlem stayed Harlem. And the agreement born in a Manhattan nightclub continued long after the door of a federal prison closed behind him. Lucky Luciano survived the confrontation over Harlem. He was not arrested because of that meeting. He was not attacked. He was not publicly embarrassed. He left the United States under federal deportation orders 3 weeks later, just as planned. But he left with a lasting consequence. For the first time in years, a territory in New York had refused full absorption into the mafia structure and remained independent under negotiated terms. Harlem was not taken. It was recognized. Luciano's empire continued in his absence. Frank Costello managed operations in New York. Albert Anastasia maintained control of the docks. Maya Lansky handled financial channels. The 5 families remained powerful. Yet something had shifted. The understanding was clear. Harlem was not open territory. It was not a space to test casually. It was governed by an agreement backed by evidence and discipline. Behavior across the environment changed. Italian soldiers did not patrol Harlem streets. Couriers handled payments quietly. Business disputes were addressed through conversation rather than force. The 10% share arrived monthly without interruption. The message required no repetition. When Johnson was imprisoned in 1951, no crew moved to claim Harlem by force. The agreement continued. Support was extended to Johnson's family. Collections remained organized. The system adapted rather than expanded. Within organized crime circles, the meeting at the Stork Club became a reference point. It was not remembered for violence. It was remembered for restraint. Men who had built reputations through enforcement began to acknowledge another form of strength. Luciano survived and continued his life in Italy. But the understanding that Harlem could not be taken without cost remained attached to his legacy. Johnson, after serving his sentence, returned in 1963 to a territory that had not collapsed in his absence. The transformation was not dramatic. It was structural. Power in New York still belonged to the mafia network. But Harlem stood as proof that negotiation backed by leverage could reshape expectations. No further attempts were made to patrol its streets openly. The boundary held. When the events of 1946 were reviewed years later, a clear pattern emerged. Escalation. Warnings. System vulnerability. It began with a demand for 40%. It continued with quiet threats. It reached its peak when photographs exposed corruption that protected the larger organization. Each step increased tension. Each warning was measured. Each side tested the other without firing a shot. The system that allowed organized crime to flourish depended on secrecy, political protection, and internal discipline. When Johnson revealed evidence that could damage that system, he exposed its weakness. The escalation did not come from shouting. It came from confidence. Luciano believed expansion was natural. He believed Harlem would either join willingly or be pressured into compliance. The warnings were clear. Johnson asked what would happen if he refused. Luciano answered plainly. Johnson responded with documentation. System failure was visible in the photograph itself. A high-ranking mafia figure standing beside a police captain. Protection that relied on remaining hidden. The conclusion was unavoidable. Open war would damage both sides. Exposure would weaken political shields. Negotiation was the only stable outcome. Years later, those who studied organized crime history noted that the agreement lasted more than 2 decades. It survived deportation. It survived imprisonment. It survived leadership changes. That endurance validated the strategy used in that VIP room. The pattern showed that patience was not surrender. Restraint was not weakness. Leverage, when held quietly, could alter the balance of power without bloodshed. Harlem remained under Johnson's control until his later years. The Mafia continued to dominate much of New York. Neither side destroyed the other. The events of February 1946 did not end organized crime. But they demonstrated that even within criminal systems, structure and negotiation could override impulse. Escalation had been present. Warnings had been issued. The system had revealed its limits. And the final outcome, an agreement that endured for 22 years, proved that the confrontation was resolved not by force, but by calculation. Long after the meeting at the Stork Club, the story continued to circulate. It moved through backrooms and union halls. It was repeated in Harlem barbershops and downtown social clubs. It traveled across the Atlantic to Italy, where Lucky Luciano lived out his remaining years. It was told not with excitement, but with quiet respect. Not because of spectacle. There had been no gunfire in that VIP room. No bodies carried out under white sheets. No headlines announcing a gang war avoided. On paper, it looked like a business agreement between criminals. But those who understood power saw something deeper. 2 systems met at one table. One controlled most of New York's underworld. The other controlled Harlem through trust and discipline. Both had the ability to cause damage. Both had reasons to escalate. They did not. The meaning was found in restraint. Bumpy Johnson proved that independence could survive inside a larger empire if it was defended with preparation and calm. He did not beg for protection. He did not reject partnership outright. He redefined it. Lucky Luciano, a man known for organization and reform inside the Mafia, recognized strength when he saw it. He adjusted rather than forcing a confrontation that would weaken his own structure before deportation. In places like this, survival depends on understanding limits. Harlem remained Harlem for more than 2 decades under that agreement. The 10% was paid. The streets were not patrolled by outside soldiers. The boundary drawn in 1946 held firm. When Johnson was imprisoned, the structure endured. When he returned, it was still standing. The system had been built to survive more than one man. The story endured because it showed that power is not always loud. Sometimes it sits still, listens carefully, and speaks only when necessary. It also showed that respect, once earned, can shape behavior more effectively than fear. In the end, the meeting at the Stork Club became part of organized crime legend not for violence, but for control. Control of emotion. Control of information. Control of territory. The lesson was simple and lasting. Even in a world ruled by force, the strongest position may belong to the one who knows exactly when not to use it. In the end, power belongs not to the loudest voice, but to the one who understands the cost of every move.